Jester King. Hey, Anne Claire. And we have another person from Austin, someone else from Atlanta. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have y'all here. And I think we'll give maybe one more minute and then I'll go ahead and jump into introductions. But we're really excited for y'all to be here. As we're going along, I'll mention this again a few times, but if you have questions as we go, feel free to put those into the Q&A section. Ronnie and I will be able to see those and we can ask them as we run through. So we're really excited to be able to chat with these guys. Oh, Quebec, Canada. Cool. We have someone.
Yay, got Canada. I have Justin Trudeau socks on right now. I don't know if you can see them. See? Nice. Justin Trudeau. Anyway.
All right.
So I'd vote for.
Hey, Louis.
Hey, Louis.
Seen you so much lately. I love it.
Is everybody doing
all right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Oh, Indie Wineries. Hi. So,
hi, Gav.
Excited for the panel that we have today. And it was really funny because I was chatting with our team before everyone got on and we were shocked because we got a room for 100 people and then it was like there were 90 registrations and we were very shocked that we had to even consider getting larger room sizes. So then I thought about who we were having on. I was like, okay, everyone that's actually on this panel is really dope. So I'm excited and it makes perfect sense why everyone would want to come see a conversation with these lovely men and women. So how this is going to work is Ronnie and I will be moderating and then we'll pose different questions to our 4 panelists. We'll intro you guys in a moment. And then from there, again, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put those in and we will ask them as well as we're kind of walking through this panel. So to get started, Ronnie and I each invited 2 people. So I'll speak the introductions to the 2 people that I invited, and then Rania can go after. So I'm really excited to be joined by Rachel Cigna. So one of the first people that I actually called when I started my company was Rachel. And I didn't even know her. I just loved her magazine and I wanted to figure out a way to incorporate it into what we were doing at MYSA. At the time it was called Through the Grapevine. And Rachel, I believe are you from Virginia?
Yeah, I'm from Arlington, which is outside DC.
Yeah, so she was like from around the DC area, and she's not only an amazing winemaker, but she also has this great publication and is a natural wine journalist. So I loved the idea of having her perspective from both takes on this topic. And then ironically also from the DC area, I didn't mean to go all DC on this, but I also wanted to invite Eric Moore, who I feel like is really just the person that has like their hand on the pulse of what's happening with natural wine. Like when I think about like who is the coolest natural wine person I know, I literally always think of Eric. And we'll ask you about some of these recent articles that you've been in because you just are this like amazing voice in the community. So after we were talking about having winemakers on, we really wanted to get a perspective that also came from more of like a sommelier and also a retail perspective. And I couldn't think of someone better to voice that than Eric. So these are my 2 picks, and then Rania, you can go.
Yeah, so the first 2 people that I thought about were Martha and Bree, and I believe that I met both of you guys sometime last year planning the first Wonder Woman of Wine conference and was super excited to get connected with you guys. But I know that Martha, you were really like the first woman in the natural wine world that I actually ever met. And was just truly inspired by the work that you were doing in Northern California. And I've always loved your lineup of wines. And I love the labels. I think that you as a person are particularly just lovely. And when you spoke at the conference last year, I know that it was really, it was very special to have you there. And same goes for Bree. I tried to get you to come to the conference. Unfortunately, did not work out last year. But we did connect because just of the great wines that you're producing up in Oregon. And then obviously your husband, Chad Stock, has come to Austin several times and tasted wines with us. And we helped collaborate with your new project. So Bree makes limited edition wines up in Willamette Valley. And then that's under the Constant Crush, which is one of your I guess you're the umbrella of limited edition wines. And so 2 of my favorites, natural winemakers in the States.
And Rania's amazing husband made our labels, designed our labels from Yeah, from very random comments that I could give Chris, he came up with all my labels and logos. So he's amazing.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Vintel Wine.
Thanks for the
Just a plug.
All right, so with that, let's jump in. And the first question I'll ask, and this one's posed to all of you guys. We'd love to just initially know what your first experience was with natural wine, and what do you find to sort of be the most important characteristic of natural wine? Like, what drew you to it?
I can start. I'm actually writing a book, which is a memoir right now. So this is very fresh in my memory. And so I was living in Brooklyn, and I was I historically had worked in restaurants, but I took a long break, and then I sort of crawled my way back to a job waiting tables because I was trying to write a novel. And this restaurant, Renard, inside the Wythe Hotel, had an amazing wine director, another incredible woman in wine, Lee Campbell. And her list was pretty much all natural and mostly French. And I immediately noticed the different way that people talked about wine. Nobody mentioned scores, and nobody talked about like prestige or awards. And there was, well, I won't say there was no snobbery. There was like a different kind of snobbery. People talked about traveling to France and meeting these winemakers and going to parties at their homes. And there was a pet nat from the Loire Valley, Lake Capriade. I think in the US, it's probably still with Sélection Massal. And the wine was fizzy and kind of simple, but also kind of like not simple. It had so many flavors. To me, it was more complex because it was alive. And I noticed that it made me energetic. It didn't feel like kind of sappy the way a lot of sparkling wines normally did. And so I think for me, there's a lot of characteristics that I would say set natural wine apart. But yeah, I would just say liveliness first and foremost, like actually really more like things in the bottle that are genuinely alive is the main thing.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in next. So I always had an interest in environmental studies and how we interact with our planet. And that kind of coupled with a real fascination with food systems and food history and how these like kind of how our politics and history on a macro level has really shaped what we eat and drink and how we interact on a daily basis with things. And so, you know, when I graduated from college, I went to work on a farm in Italy that was like a full circle. You know, there was livestock, grapes, all sorts of different products there. And I think tasting these wines, which, you know, the people on the farm called them themselves peasant wine, which was just that it was kind of like a creative expression and something that they had cultivated and cared for these vines throughout the year. And then there was this moment where they could enjoy it and enjoy it with their friends and their community. And that just got me so much more interested in wine in general. I assumed that that's how the whole wine world was, not growing up in the industry. And so when I came back to California from that experience, I said I wanted to work in a winery, and it was this huge shift in terms of, you know, some of the things that Rachel touched on, how to more formulaically create a wine that matched a certain score. And that was really prevalent when I was starting in the industry and before. So I started making wine in 2006 under, you know, for working for other people. And so I had this feeling that these things were, you know, somewhat incongruent. And this experience I had in Italy was maybe just on the small farm and that it didn't exist elsewhere. And so when I started apprenticing and wanting to work for smaller families and smaller producers, whether or not they were, you know, identifying as making natural wines or not, I saw certain practices come up again and again in the wines that I really felt connected with. And, you know, Rachel also mentioned this word about being energized. I think there's this, you know, when you watch how people care for the vines all year long, there's not necessarily a need or a desire to really obscure where those grapes are coming from. And so I think a lighter hand in the cellar just kind of matches that idea of we should celebrate where, you know, the labor and the love that went into growing these grapes. And so that really appealed to me. And slowly but surely, I realized that the majority of the wines I was drinking, yes, were from small producers, but it wasn't just that. It was the way that they were being made that was also special. And that happened to fall into this natural wine category the more I learned about it.
Eric or Bree, do you have anything to chime in with?
So, sorry, Eric. We'll let you tie it up at the end. So I think it was maybe 2005. I remember moving back to Australia from BC, and Gary Mills had a wine, I think it was a Chenin Blanc, rejected from export by the AWRI, the Australian Wine Research Institute, and the governing body Wine Australia, who gave you permission. You had to send in samples to make sure that your wines had a legal level of VA and acceptable faults. And so Gary had an importer in Japan where he was, you know, very big, Jamshid Wines, and the importer, you know, thought the wine was delicious and really wanted, you know, to continue to sell these wines, and he wasn't able to get an export certificate for it because it had higher than legal limits of VA. You know, I think the US limit is maybe is it 0.8 or 1.2 for legal in the US as well. But that got me thinking about, you know, different cultures and governing bodies and who was deeming something, you know, delicious or acceptable, or, you know, a wine of quality or a place or whatever it was. And it started me thinking about different cultures and how they approach, you know, fermentation in their culture and in what they're doing every day. And then it also got me thinking about, you know, certifications in governing bodies, ingredient labeling in wine, which there are none. And so that's something that has been probably for the last, I don't know, how long is that? Nearly 15 years, something that's been, you know, very top of mind for me, is about how do we assess wines and what is, you know, classic, what is natural, what is terroir, and all of these, you know, conforming pieces that come into the wine world. So it really started with Gary, and it was something that, you know, talking to him was about, you know, he's buying fruit from growers who are farming organically or biodynamically, and then he doesn't want to manipulate anything in the cellar. So occasionally you have a barrel that goes awry, or, you know, that you get more lift than you'd like in it. And so this disconnect between farming and what the fruit that you're buying and the intent behind the fruit that the farmer has for it, and then what you're making it into a wine, and then to have someone else tell you that it's not delicious or it's not acceptable and that there's no market for it, were all things that aligned for me with that we had a very conventional and very industrial wine production system that needed to have some questioning applied to it.
I mean, for me, it's, you know, somewhat similar to Rachel. I worked in restaurants. I worked my way up through restaurants, but I always needed somewhere to go kind of after, and I would find this place in Pittsburgh that actually specialized in natural wine. And I didn't really know much about the genre itself, but I trusted somebody to kind of just guide me and pour things for me and let me know, what, they thought about a certain wine. And they wouldn't, the person, his name's Dominic, he wouldn't, push me in any certain direction that was off any sort of crazy path, but he was careful, and in his introduction, for me to those wines was something that was super formative for me. And I didn't know at the time actually that they were natural wines. I didn't know at the time that there was this whole sort of movement that had happened within winemaking to go back to a simpler style, a style where you're adding less, but you're making sure that you're paying attention to important things and doing the work before you have to get into the cellar, making sure you're doing that farming work. And it was unbelievable because, my taste sort of shifted, and I started asking for wines as I started running beverage programs, and I started asking about producers, and people would just bring me things, and I fell deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole. So I really have restaurants to thank for my entire kind of experience when it comes to delving into this subject. And I'm happy to be here, obviously, but like I have so many people to thank for guiding my journey here, and it's not possible without those relationships.
Awesome. So the next question I'd like to direct to Martha and Bree. Sustainability is a leading topic of discussion in the realm of natural wine, but it seems like most of the natural wines that we see in retail shops and on social media are often European in origin. So how do you guys think that global shipping and trade play into the conversation about sustainability, and should we be drinking more locally made wines?
Well, the answer is yes, we should be drinking more locally made wines, but I am also, I will fully admit to the fact that I love drinking wines of the world. Like, it's something for me that, I am going to have a little trouble answering this question, in all honesty. It's something that, there's oftentimes, I think, what our pleasures and interests are and our joys in life are often, I think, more in line with environmental stewardship than most people let on. I think this is probably an area where, things are a little dissident, where perhaps, the majority of what we are drinking in the natural wine world comes from a place that's far away, that takes a lot to ship, So there are a lot more steps in the transportation and the carbon emissions from that transportation. I think without having done an actual inventory of those things, I think, if you're living on the East Coast or New York, shipping wine there is a lot more environmentally friendly than if you're going, or if you're close to the port that the wine comes in, then I think it's more environmentally friendly, perhaps. Certainly land travel is way less, heavy. Wine's heavy, it's a liquid. But I think also there's a question of, I think there's a balance, because I think there's a question also of, local economy and putting money back into the economy that you are a part of and the community you're a part of. So when you buy, California wine in California, you are directly supporting other Californians and Californian businesses. But there's also an aspect of, exploration and trade and creative trade that I think is really important. So I wouldn't want to do away with imports for that reason. I think, I think of wine as art in a way, and I don't think that we should cut ourselves out, off from the art of the rest of the world either. So I don't have a clear answer on that. I think it's a really good question, Rania, and a tricky one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Very complicated to answer. I would say yes, we do need to drink more local wine. Quite simply for the same reason that it does take a lot of carbon footprint to send wine across the world. But also, the distribution system in the US also comes into play in regards to a lot of the wines that are being sold here as well. And so I think that a lot of the most important portfolios and distributors and importers here require those wines from Europe that are able to be made and sold at lower price points than what can be produced in the US. There's a certain amount of history and culture that is already well established in the old world in Europe, and by way of their taxation systems, their governing bodies, the simple fact that you have, sometimes 8-9 generations coming from a single property, it's a lot more affordable for some of these wines to be made and produced and sent to us in the US here. And I think I would be terrified if I didn't have the opportunity to have those wines here in the US to be sold and to educate the market, because of what is made at a very low price point here in the US. So I think that they're a very important part of the market. And I think that while we should be drinking more local, what we should really be asking more is what does sustainable mean? And what does it mean for an industry to be sustainable as well? And I think that transverses more than just a carbon footprint or shipping and receiving and exports and all of the complications there. To Martha's point, what is sustainable in terms of having a successful and healthy community within your own wine community, within the wine industry? What is making our vineyard workers sustainable? There's a whole supply chain that needs to be addressed. But I think that all of these wines have a real place and need to be in the market, and they create inspiration for us, and they give us guiding points as well.
Thank you.
And I was going to go in a different direction, but while you're already chatting on this subject, Bree, I feel like it's a really good next step to sort of chat about human rights and labor practices, because that's something you were just talking about. So one of the questions that this is actually Ranya's question. Sorry, Ranya, I'm going to say.
Okay.
But one of the questions that we were talking about earlier was, around this practice. And there's obviously been, for anyone that's very nerdy in the natural wine world will know there's been a lot of headlines lately about this sector and potential human rights violations. So what do you guys think are the steps that winemakers should be taking to advocate for the humane treatment of laborers? And do you think that I think all of you would probably agree that this is an important part of the winemaking process, but first, do you agree with that? And what do you think should be happening?
Okay, Rachel.
Yes, I agree. Yes, it is something that should be happening. I think it's really interesting that this came up in 2020, and I would definitely note that it kind of happened on the heels of this really big Black Lives Matter protest movement that I think raised consciousness globally. So yes, like Valentina Passalacqua's father being arrested kind of sparked it, but I think the outrage was greater because of this moment that we're in. And what I'm starting to see, and what I really think there should be more of, is transparency about labor being just as accessible as transparency about farming and sulfur. And like everything else, I think with natural wine, it's probably going to be complicated, and it's probably going to be like, I don't think we're going to see an ethical labor certification anytime too soon. Just as, there are lots of natural winemakers whose vineyards are not certified organic. So I don't think certifying your labor is going to be as easy. But I do think there's so many ways for producers and importers to become transparent about who's doing the work, whether that's at the very minimum, sharing with your followers on social media. Here's our vineyard crew. Here's our intern. Like, here's the team that's coming and trimming the shoots on the vines in spring, and really giving those people like a face, and making them part of your operation, or putting it on your website. I mean, every winemaker has different levels of kind of explicitness in terms of, like, winemakers say how much sulfur they add. They might not say what kind of sulfur, right? Who even knew there's different kinds of sulfur? There are. But at this, and so similarly, you might say we pay our workers above minimum wage. You might not specify the exact amount. The important thing is we need to start. I think it really needs to start somewhere, because it's not happening at all. And I would absolutely love that. And I guess switching journalist cap to winemaker cap, we should talk more about who helps us to make our wine. And I have tried to do that over the years, and I think we should do it more. It is often migrant laborers, more so in the like New World, but that also happens in Europe. And I think that we need to really recognize these people and kind of erode the distinction between like skilled labor and unskilled labor, similar to kind of what happens in restaurants as well. And I think it's a good start anyway that we're having this discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important subject. Where to start? I love the idea of giving props or giving a face to those people in the vineyard. I think sometimes in the US we have struggles with that because of their documentation. So I would like to see it at a winemaker level, that if you are purchasing fruit from farmers or growers, I would like to know that they know what that worker population is being paid. Do they have minimum wage? Do they have healthcare included? A lot of vineyards in the US are run by vineyard management companies. So I would like the growers to be holding the vineyard management companies accountable for who's in their vineyard and who's working in their vineyard. And that they're protected, and that they're safe, and that they have an avenue to healthcare, that they have reliable employment, that there's certain standards around their conditions, especially years like this where we have, smoke in the vineyard, and a shortage of PPE masks. How is this being enforced? What are the concessions being given for timing? When you're paying people by bucket in the time of a respiratory pandemic and a smoke influence in the vineyard, that just there seems like there needs to be huge conversations and huge concessions made around the health of the vineyard workers and how quickly that delivery needs to be made of fruit, and understanding that this is where they make the bulk of their money for the season, and that they're going to put themselves in that harm's way if you give them the opportunity. So there needs to be, I like that California has a lot of OSHA standards regarding air quality. Not a lot of states have that for agricultural workers. So I think that's a start. I think having a certification where that it's again that supply chain. We have a relationship with our grower who has a direct relationship with the vineyard management company or the growers, the laborers that are coming in and working that, and I can tell you exactly what the price they're paid is, what their salary is, if they have health care, and be able to have a conversation around that. I think also that's one of the reasons we work with alternative varieties in the Willamette Valley, is because Pinot Noir is, a single variety that generally often needs to be harvested all at the same time. If I have a diversity of varieties, my fruit's the only fruit hanging out there at the moment in the vineyard. So I hope that by having varieties that need to be pruned at different times, that need to be harvested at different times, will really extend that season for the vineyard worker and allow, more salaried positions, more full-time positions. It gives them security. It gives us a better community to live in. And at the end of the day, it's more equitable for everybody.
Yeah, I think this whole discussion happening, and especially with it happening this year, it illuminated a huge blind spot for this industry. I feel like we cared about so many other things, and we put this kind of face of like, consideration onto a lot of superficial things, a lot of things that really aren't as important as the one that we're talking about right now. Nobody was really asking, about labor practices. Nobody was really, going and checking on their producers and seeing what was happening, seeing who was doing this work, seeing who were working these long hours, and they weren't seeing the conditions in which they were done in. So it's fantastic that we're able to have this conversation, but I feel like it's a little bit overdue, because I feel like this is something that, in terms of natural wine, this is something that we should have been questioning, because the human element of our business. So how could we not be asking those questions? How could we not be considering these things when it really comes to the this term, natural wine?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add really quickly. I am very happy about the larger social pressures that are happening right now. I have felt in the past that as a small producer, I did not have as much leverage, honestly. I'll be totally frank. So when I had brought these things up, in years prior to 2020, I couldn't necessarily tell my growers, listen, it's not just me demanding answers about this. It's the whole public. It's my distributors. And I hate to use that as a pressure. I wish that people would just said, yeah, this is important, we should talk about it, but actually putting a little financial pressure on the situation at times is very helpful. And I've found that has been a huge benefit of the fact that this has been publicly talked about. There's a lot of interest there. It's important to keep our customers, our end customers happy, and it's important to obviously the human rights element is extremely important, but for those who maybe don't see eye to eye with me or are not quite as passionate, that's been a really helpful thing about this year. I also think I encourage, us as winemakers to try to educate people. So, I myself am always learning. I was very, very surprised to hear when I started working in the vineyards in California that I was under different labor laws than the rest of California. So different overtime laws. I don't think most people know that. And I think if people knew that, they would start to, we have since passed a law that's phasing that out, but getting involved with the legislation too is hugely important. Again, I mentioned that whole thing about I'm actually a pretty small purchaser of fruit, and I'm a pretty small player. I think we can also band together as winemakers for a more unified voice. But I think it's hugely important too to look to legislation and see what are the causes. As in California, we vote on propositions. So, this was a proposition on the ballot, really try to get loud about those things. So we can pass better labor laws. I did have one experience this year that I thought was interesting. And I don't know, Rachel, if this is what you meant when you touched on this, but skilled versus unskilled labor, I think debunking that myth too. I think a lot of people think that everyone who works in the vineyard is unskilled, and that's like very far from the truth. It takes years and years and years of experience to learn how to grow grapevines, especially for wine. It is, and most of the people who work in the vineyards that I work with know more about growing grapes than I do. It's not something that is easy to do. But I actually had one foreman who I spoke to who didn't want to talk about how much he made for fear that someone would say that is too much. You don't deserve it as a migrant worker. So I think there's also that issue too, where we have to, again, putting a face to them, to the people who are making the wine and growing the grapes, but also communicating with them that like this should not be an area of fear to talk about these things.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Martha, and making that more acceptable and front of mind to be able to speak about and actually have people asking those questions from every level, not only the distributors, the sommeliers, winemakers asking the growers what their chain of command is or what their understanding of it is. But I think also that in the natural wine community, I think it also needs to be addressed a lot more. I remember, I think it was Mike Benny, when he did Rootstock, was getting incredibly frustrated with the amount of people that were claiming that they were, natural, this wine was natural. And it was like, okay, so you don't add sulfur and then that's supposed to be a natural wine. We know this is a conventionally farmed vineyard. We know that the workers in that vineyard are being exposed to X, Y, and Z, chemicals, herbicides, and yet, this is being celebrated as a natural wine. I think there needs to be a lot more conversation from supporters of natural wine about, is this fruit farmed respectfully, intentfully, without herbicides, without chemicals? What are the labor practices? There needs to be an entire conversation through natural wine if this is going to be, it's not just no sulfur or low sulfur or no manipulations in the cellar. It's a whole lot more than that, and it needs to be questioned a lot more.
And that's a great jumping off point to the next question I want to ask, because I think the conversation we're having about labor practices is, we could talk about this forever because it's so important, but I want to get one more question in before we take it to the audience. So this is directed at Eric, and then you guys can also chime in if you have thoughts. But so there's a simultaneous conversation happening about clean wine, and I know that you obviously have been part of a recent article about this topic. Clean wine and its place in the diet and wellness culture that's so prevalent in our generation. So how do you separate what mainstream media categorizes as clean wine versus the style of wine that you sell at your shop, and why this distinction is important for consumers?
I think this this was a very entertaining one. I think a lot of it really comes down to the fact that the conversations about clean wine are centered around lifestyle. They're centered around a brand. It's centered around how this can be an alternative in a more healthy way of drinking, whereas producers, especially like the ones that we have here, are people who live this, who this is what they do every day. It's not just some passing thing where we're trying to sell something via buzzwords and branding. That's the big kind of divide for me, is that these are people who give their lives to this, who this means more than just a paycheck. I think a lot of what Bree said, with consumers and even us as buyers on the retail front, paying attention to how is this fruit being farmed, how are the people who are working these vineyards being treated. That is a huge kind of line of delineation for me, and when it comes to discussing what we mean by natural wine, what we mean by clean wine, which is not a phrase I really enjoy, because I feel like, again, it's just a promotion for something that isn't real. I think that we have a lot of conversations as buyers, with distributors, with winemakers, about the reasoning behind why they do things, and the reasoning behind a lot of things is for the benefit of people now, and then people in the future, the people who are going to inherit the land that they're farming, people who are going to try to make a living in the next generation. It's so much deeper than just a product that's put on your table whenever you choose to consume it.
Sorry, anyone else want to chime in on that?
All right, well then while we're waiting for questions from the audience to come in, I have a fun one that I'd like to more pose to Rachel, but I think that it is relevant to all of you guys, and that's around like opportunities within the natural wine space. So I know we're talking a bit about what goes into it, but I also think that the audience that we have here is really captive, not just because like we're basically preaching to the choir here. I believe that everyone that's probably here right now is very supportive and like really passionate about this topic. And a lot of them I know that I speak to like want to get involved in natural wine. So I'd love to know, I like Rachel's perspective on this because you have two different perspectives here as both a journalist and a winemaker, but just broadly, like what opportunities are there for people that want to get involved in natural wine? Where is it going, and where are all the ways that they can fit in, whether they know everything and they're already a advanced somm, or they're just getting started and they want to figure out a way that they can navigate this space?
Well, it's a little different in a pandemic because you can't necessarily go to raw wine fair and you can't necessarily go abroad to work vintage. And those previously were probably two really good entry points, kind of depending on where you were. But you can continue to support your local wine club or local retailer. And, I think being a little social media savvy, you can find out pretty quickly who that is near you, and give them your dollars and read about the wines, whether it's online or in Pipette or wherever, and just educate yourself that way. A writer named Sydney Love wrote about a really interesting project going on at the moment called Industry Sessions, and that was a collaboration between Jirka Jira from Ordinaire and James James from New York City, and they're providing online education for free to people of color around the US who are in wine or starting to get into the wine industry and who want more education. That's a great project. So I would definitely encourage people, if you fit into kind of the target of who they're trying to reach, to look into that and see if you can get in. There's shops also providing wines for free to the participants. And I'd love to see more of that. But a harvest internship still is like a great opportunity. I think now it has to be done probably more locally, I think even a year from now. And ideally, if you can like plan to do a month. So this also comes up to the topic we were discussing a few minutes ago about like ethical labor. And I think we're going to see more winemakers also reconsidering harvest internships. I know it's something we think about because generally or traditionally the idea, and I've done a harvest internship, was that you'd kind of pay your own way, you'd show up at the winery, they'd give you some place to sleep, they'd feed you, and in exchange, you're just absorbing experience and information by picking and working in the cellar and kind of having these like really wonderful experiences, whether or not you're qualified. So like maybe if you've got like a degree from UC Davis, you probably wouldn't do that sort of thing. You'd already be getting paid, but this is maybe more for someone who's a journalist or a somm, or even an enthusiast. So it is a great opportunity. It does kind of come into sort of an ethical gray zone that I think we're going to see people talking about more, I hope, in the next year or so. But there's no better way to really deepen your knowledge than picking and kind of being in the the war zone when grapes are coming in and people are processing them and trying to help out and really seeing what goes on. There's also oft times winemakers need help with bottling and labeling, packing. And so if you have some downtime or can sign on to work for 3 months or 6 months, there's a lot to be seen. There's pruning as well that goes on in the off season. So I recommend all of that.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that at the moment in the US, it's a great time to have local somms actually working in the cellar as well, because they've been furloughed and they can come out and for minimal, if they can find a room to stay somewhere, and we do pay minimum wage and everything like that, and have labor standards, but it's been a really good opportunity for us to have these great palettes in our cellars as well, and sharing their visions and their experiences from working in restaurants in Chicago and beyond, but it's great to have them in our cellars at the moment, and it's really adding a really deep dynamic to the team as well.
Yeah, and Bree reminded me of something when she was saying that, is there's also, if you go online, there's been a lot of really cool workshops. And I know, we don't always want to spend every second on Zoom, but there's been a lot of opportunity, with sommeliers who've been furloughed, people who, who are wine professionals who are very passionate and want to share their knowledge. And, often there's a sliding scale for these things too. So I think it's a really great opportunity if you have the means to support, somebody in the industry who is furloughed. And if you don't, it's a great way to learn.
Great. So let's take a couple questions from the attendees. We have one from Grace, and I think that's, Rachel, you touched on this a bit a second ago, but Grace is asking, when you're trying to get your foot in the door in any industry, it's hard to turn down an opportunity, even if it doesn't include pay. How do you recommend getting experience in winemaking and being properly compensated for it?
Sorry, did you want me to talk more about that?
Sure, yeah, if you'd like to.
I recommend negotiating with the producer, but you're gonna really have to make a case for what you can do. So if you have skills, like if you can drive a forklift, if you can sort of be left alone to process grapes so the winemaker can actually do something else, or if you can drive a tractor, then you can get paid. If not, you really are there to learn, and you probably are going to more likely, you could negotiate for perhaps getting your travel compensated, I think is something really fair to ask. Or you could, like, obviously free meals, I think should be more or less a given if you're doing like an internship. But yeah, I think saving up money also, and sort of like being prepared to kind of meet the producer halfway is perhaps realistic if you are at the moment unable to do any of the skills that I described. So I think it is like a question of where you are in your career, because to some extent you are getting paid in experience. And then the next year you can ask to be, I think, compensated financially, because you will have like way more experience and way more of a skill set. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, if you're asking to just come for a week to help out, that's sort of a roving, position that you can, get a lot of different experience doing different things. But if, in Oregon, we have to pay people the minimum wage, it's minimum wage, but at least it's a salary. But you have to commit to being there for, at least 4 to 6 weeks for the bulk of harvest to be able to be reliable. So I think, if you're willing to do that and take minimum wage, then I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for you.
Yeah, what I did when I was apprenticing was flip-flopped. So in the New World, we do have labor laws. There are, we lawfully are not allowed to have even like volunteers. I mean, I'm sure there's gray area there, but I often, I dove in as a full-time person. So, but I would flip-flop where I would do a New World harvest. So I had enough money to pay for what I viewed in my mind as school. It's a harvest internship in Europe, and room and board was part of it, but so I could pay my travel expenses. And I know not everybody's in that position where they can make that, one New World vintage stretch the whole year. It depends, I know, on what you're coming from, but I'm also hoping that there'll be, I'm hoping there'll be more funding that will come through to help with that in the future. But it is, you really are pinching your pennies in that route, but I think of it as an investment, again, like paying to go to school. So it's a mixed bag.
All right, so we probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So if you have one, make sure to put it in there. We had one that I found interesting about clean wine that I think Eric might want a stab at again. So do you think that it matters if clean wine is just a marketing term, if it gets more people into natural wine generally? So I'd love to hear what you have to think about that, Eric, and any of our winemakers as well.
I mean, no, I don't have, obviously it's what marketing is for. I don't have a problem if that is, I don't care how people get into natural wine. I think it's fantastic when people are interested in wine in general. But no, I don't think it matters, if it's just a marketing term. I do think it matters that I feel in a lot of ways it's a little deceptive. I feel that that's a big part of it. That would be my biggest gripe about the entire thing. But no, I don't think, I don't think as an entry point, I think that's marketing doing its own job. And I think it's important that, we try to get as many people to drink these wines and give recognition to the producers as we possibly can. So I don't see it as a huge issue. I just don't like the kind of deceptive nature of it.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous when you start seeing people coming through wineries asking about how they wash their grapes. That's kind of bullshit at another level, that type of marketing. I'm sorry. I'm an Aussie, I swear, sorry. But I do think if it gets, someone to pick up a bottle and turn it around looking for ingredient labeling or something on there, like they do with their organic soup or vegetables, I think that is a positive. But yeah, I think that I think there just needs to be more transparency. And so I think that in some ways it can be a good thing for having people understand that, well, there's a whole lot of shit that people put in their wines, to my husband, that, some wines have as much additives in them as a Hungry Man TV dinner, so what kind of wine are you drinking?
Sorry.
Yeah. So, but hopefully if there is more, I would love to assume that those marketing dollars spent by large companies are actually benefiting, smaller producers who are taking the steps to make things, but I really don't think that's a reality. But, I am hoping that if people are buying closer to the supply chain. So they're going into their local shop and they're, can't do this right now. Maybe you can do it online, but they're talking to the person and really learning about what does it mean to make a wine in a way that doesn't have additives. And also, think, I hate to be blunt, but like, what is the price that you're paying, and what, can we tease out what those dollars are going to? If they're going mostly to marketing, then probably the product itself is not getting a lot of those dollars spent on it. If it's not, then, yeah, you might be much closer to a clean wine than you think.
I just wanted to add something that came to mind. The problem, I think, with clean wine is that it puts the emphasis on consumption. So it's better for you. It's like taking a vitamin, blah, blah. But what we're trying to go after with natural wine is about production. It's better for the planet. It's better for the workers. It's made in an ethical way. That was really where natural wine has always come from. And I think we get led astray with clean wine. And I don't think that it will probably result in the kind of consumer who thinks deeply about how something is made and where it's come from in the way that natural wine sort of wants to encourage.
Great. Should we take one more question? Maybe just a brief one. Okay, so let's see, from an anonymous attendee, why is everyone so obsessed with the conversation about sulfur in natural wine? If you can, if anyone can answer that briefly.
You see me quickly unmuting.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, it's, I'll let other people talk because I just spoke a second ago, but we covered this in issue 4 of Pipette because I knew this sentiment is something a lot of people feel what is the deal with sulfur? And I think it is a polarizing topic for a number of reasons. And one is that there's this idea that a natural wine is more pure if it has 0 added sulfur. So it creates this polarity within natural wine that is not super useful. However, I think it's, people are sensitive about it for a lot of reasons. I think some producers would like to not add sulfur, and the fact is that it's just incredibly challenging, and it's I think frustrating for some producers to feel that people prefer sulfur-free wine or that it's seen as better or more ethical. So I don't think that the championing of 0 sulfur wine should be meant to put down people who add a little bit of sulfur to protect their wines. However, it is a taste preference for some people. And I'm one of them. I really love wine that's made without sulfur. And even when it does have maybe a little bit more volatile acidity. And I know that adding 20 parts of sulfur could have prevented that. But I just, I love sulfur-free wine, and I've always loved supporting producers who do take that extra risk, because I think it results in a really dynamic, lively wine. And so I think people are becoming less obsessed with sulfur. I think it's still part of the conversation, but I really loved today people talking more about labor and legislation and farming and using alternate varieties in light of climate change. And so I think the conversation is shifting, personally.
That's great. Does anyone else want to chime in before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I would just say that if you're doing the right things in the vineyard, paying attention, and if you're paying attention in the cellar and being obsessed with cleanliness in the cellar, then you should, really not require a lot of sulfur use. And I agree with Rachel. I find that excessive sulfur use just really shuts down all of the wine's personality, and it kind of comes back to that question for me of why are you farming organically or biodynamically if you're just going to manipulate the fuck out of the wines in the cellar? Don't do it. Just be intentful all the way through, and it doesn't require you to have so much additions in the wines either. And I was just going to reply to Sol quickly and say that the more transparency that wine can have, and the more people asking questions at every level, from distributor, consumer, sommelier, ask more questions, expect more from your producers, and be able to communicate why you're paying more for natural wine. That's more transparency is what we need, and more education.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you guys for your time, for your expertise. I know this is a really busy time, especially in winemaking. You guys are in the middle of harvest. There's a lot happening in the world right now. So we appreciate you taking a few minutes to spend with us. And this conversation is part of a collaboration that Holly and I have been working on together as part of the MYSA and Wonder Women of Wine Club, where we're promoting natural wines made by women from all over the world. We're in our second month, and we're just really excited to be working together and to be working with wonderful people like you. So thank you guys. Please make sure that if you're attending, that you are following all of our panelists on Instagram, that you are following MYSA.wine and Wonder Women of Wine as well. And thank you guys again. You should be receiving a recording of this video, and we look forward to having you on next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
It was great to see you all.
You too.
Wonderful to see you too. Happy harvest.
Yeah, good luck with harvest, guys. Sorry about the weird faces. My baby's over here, and I was just.
Oh, I definitely knew what that was all about.
I was nearly doing this back.
Also, I was like, oh, it's a baby. It's a baby.
Oh, all right. Well, hope to see some of you guys soon.
See y'all after COVID.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Bye. Thanks, Rania. Thanks, Holly.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Eric.